Let's get the recording going. Perfect. All right. So everyone has turned in papers, I think. Or I hope, at least, I should say. I haven't had a chance to look at any of them yet. My goal is going to be to try to get those rated over the weekend, or at least get started. I'm probably just, as an unfortunate side effect of just having a lot less time now, not going to be able to write the same level of comments that I did in the first case, but I'll at least try to get close with the level of comments that I can make on the papers. Yep, and I will hopefully have those back to you at sometime early next week is my goal. We pretty much only have one more big assignment of note, the final version of this paper. So same paper, this will be during final exam week itself. It'll be worth more than the other two, so this one will be worth more points, and it'll be what your final grade is mostly based on. And then we also will have a few more daily assignments. We'll probably see what day actually is. It will probably go for maybe another 2 or 3 weeks with the daily assignments, I'm guessing. And then probably that last week of class, we'll take a break on them. Go easy there. So that's pretty much it in terms of semester grades. Any questions about any of the sort of business sorts of issues? All right. Looks like we're good on that front then. So today we're going to finish up our talking about Nietzsche. We might go a little bit short today. It might be a little bit shorter than usual. I hope you can forgive me of that if we need to do that. Heidegger starts going a little more Heidegger-y than we need to actually go into. We're more just concerned with his reading of Nietzsche, so we're going to skip some parts of the reading, but we'll try to focus on some of the key parts of it at least. And then what we're going to do on Thursday, there's not going to be a reading. I'm actually just going to try to do a one-day broad overview of what is this Platonism that both Heidegger and Nietzsche is talking about. What actually is Platonic philosophy? And then the following Tuesday, we'll see how the early Christian and Jewish church fathers use Platonism as sort of the foundation of understanding Christianity. So sort of this philosophical tool that they use to ground Christianity itself. Now I'll give you some readings, I'll give you a couple readings from a couple different authors, some Jewish, some Christian ones. That we'll just sort of see the Platonism in action. So that's the plan for the next couple of days. And I think at the end of that should give us a pretty reasonable idea of what we mean by this idea of transcendence. So we should get that piece done. And then we can start sort of seeing how this idea of transcendence is at play, or how it is not at play in various different traditions. So that's my goal for the next little bit. Any questions or thoughts about any of that? All right, then let's get started. Let's just begin with doing some review of the last class period. So we've been working on Nietzsche. Nietzsche thinks that a lot of the systems of valuations that we see in the world, and what do I mean by a system of valuation? I just mean like the things you say are important, meaningful, or valuable, right? And there's different people say different things are important, meaningful, and valuable, and there's different sort of systems of making sense of what's valuable, fitting all the values together. One example, the master and slave moralities. These are both different systems of valuation. Each of them said different things were important and sort of gave a sort of unified account of why what was important, why what wasn't important was not important. So a lot of the systems of valuations, especially all the ones that have been dominant for the last 2,000 plus years of Western history, presuppose the idea of transcendence, presuppose the idea that there's something beyond the world that we just look around ourselves and see. Right? There's something more to it than that. As systems of valuation, the system doesn't make sense if there's not something transcendent. This was true in the case of slave morality. Slave morality was the claim that the masters, the warrior classes that are running around killing, enslaving, raping, murdering, pillaging, plundering people, that not only does that suck for me, that I am the victim of their actions, but that those masters themselves are evil, that they're bad. They're the ones who are unblessed. The ones who are truly blessed by God are those who are weak, those who are powerless, those who are unhappy, quite literally. I mean, leading quite obviously unhappy lives. That's actual blessedness. Blessedness isn't that. That doesn't really make any sense if all I'm doing is just looking at the world around me, right? The world around me suggests that it's way better to be a warrior than it is to be the person that's getting stabbed by the warrior with a spear. If that's false, there must be something beyond, below, through, besides the world that just appears to be. There must be some truth to the world that goes beyond the mere appearance of the world. The same thing is true with the aesthetic ideal, right? The aesthetic ideal is that we should renounce the sensible world, the world around us, only use sensible things, especially pleasure, insofar as it helps us attain to some true world that can only be realized by denial, right? So I attain Nibbana in the context of Theravadan Buddhism, right? By engaging in various practices of self-denial. I attain the transcendent world by giving up various pieces of the sort of apparent one, the one that I see around me. So here's the basic logic, and this is when Heidegger's sort of trying to sum up what Nietzsche is saying. The basic logic of all of this is that what Heidegger calls the logic of metaphysics. There are two worlds, a supersensible world. The job of the supersensible world is to ground, to justify, to explain the sensible world. And then sort of parasitically attendant to that, there's the sensible world whose job is to be grounded in the supersensible. Right? So why should I... the basic structure just here is, why should I think things are important? Because the supersensible world says they're important in some sense. That's the basics of it. Why is it that justice is better than injustice? Because if you go to the supersensible world, that's the answer you'll find. Why is it, you can do this in other arenas, that 1 + 1 = 2, whereas, I can't really, I'm gonna find two random things on my desk. So here are two pens, right? So, but it's weird to say that they're two because they're really different. Why am I justified in ultimately saying that 1 + 1 is 2? Because super sensibly, not the sensible twos that I see, but the super sensible world, the world discovered by reason, I find that 1 + 1 is equal to 2 in that world. Or truth, whatever value you want, it has some sort of super sensible grounding to it. Why should I be just, and again, a few more examples, why should I be just, kind, good to my neighbor rather than enslaving him and making him work for me, right? Because let's be honest, it actually sounds great if people cleaned for me and I didn't have to give them money. That sounds awesome. Why shouldn't I do that? Because it's wrong. Why? I just said it sounds awesome, right? It's not wrong because of anything I see in the sensible world. The sensible world is the world where it sounds great to do this. It's wrong because of the super sensible order of things, right? The most simplistic level of cashing this out, it's wrong because God says not to. And indeed, that would be a good reason. That would indeed be, if God is everything Christianity says God is, that would be a pretty good reason indeed to think that, in fact, I should not do this thing. But it also can be outside of sort of ethical arenas. One of Nietzsche's favorites, this idea of truth, this value of truth. Why should I care that I believe a bunch of false things? Why should I change my beliefs? Because truth is important, but why? What makes truth important? Why should I care about it? Right? It's important because, to quote Galileo, truth is written in the book of nature, i.e. that's just the super sensible by another name. Or it's true if I'm Kant because of rationality. Reason demands of me that I care about truth. But again, Kantian reason, I can't see Kantian reason. I can't touch Kantian reason. I can't pick it up. Right? Reason itself seems abstract and hard for people to get their hands around. Right? That's just another way of saying the super sensible by another name. So what is the problem here? The problem, Nietzsche says, is that God is dead. This doesn't mean that God doesn't exist or that the supersensible is not real, though indeed Nietzsche thinks the supersensible is not real. The problem is that the supersensible just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't move people. People can't find it significant. They can't understand it. They can't wrap their heads around it. But that's a big problem because if we cut out the supersensible world, right? We also cut out the sensible. They sort of mutually entail each other. And one doesn't make sense without the other. So if we just cut out the supersensible world, if we cut out the ground for all values, then we're left with a world where nothing has value, or at least the value of things are themselves groundlessness, right? This lack of grounding, that's the fundamental problem here. There's no justification to anything, everything is empty. Right? And the way Nietzsche characterizes this is that the highest values devalue themselves. And that this is what's really important. It's not just that a lot of atheists happen to no longer believe in the supersensible world. That would, in a sense, be easy enough to deal with. The problem is that the supersensible world itself is the reason why people have stopped believing in the supersensible world. from love of truth, I deny that God exists. You know, I'm one of the scientific materialists who say, like, you know, I'm going to be the sort of person who faces the harsh truths of reality. And yeah, the idea of God is really comforting, but I'm going to give that up. Why? Because I love truth. But why care about truth if I deny God on the basis of it, right? The only reason to have cared about truth in the first place was because of the supersensible world. Why care about, if I'm going to reject, if I'm much more like John Stuart Mill, and I'm going to reject religion because I think religion produces injustices and wars and various kinds of conflict. Great, but then why care about justice, right? The reason I cared about justice in the first place was because it was written in the book of nature, or because it's God said so, or whatever, right? It's the super sensible world. That was what always justified why justice mattered, why goodness mattered. If I get rid of that super sensible world for the sake of justice, I also get rid of justice. I get rid of any reason to ever have cared for justice. That's the sense in which these highest values have devalued themselves, according to Nietzsche. Right. And this is supposed to be the condition that we all find ourselves in. Right? We find ourselves, all of us, Nietzsche says, in this condition of God having been dead. Right? The death of God has taken place. And as a result of it, we just now live in this sort of groundlessness of all of our values, even if we don't realize it yet. And we'll talk about today. Most people don't realize that this has taken place, but this is our current condition, the condition of the death of God. Right. So all of that was just review from last class. So none of that was new or anything. So before we go any further with anything new, any questions, thoughts, comments, ideas from last class? We had to cut off it for time reasons. So I know I didn't get to everyone's questions. So if people have questions or thoughts, please, we can start now, or we can get to them as we sort of keep moving along. Any initial comments? All right, yeah, go ahead, Tim. You should be unmuted.
So I was interested to see Heidegger's interpretation of the will to power, but if I'm not mistaken, there seems to be radically different interpretations of it, because I listened to Stephen West's Philosophize This podcast on it. His take completely different than Heidegger's. And then I read Bertrand Russell's description of it in History of Western Philosophy. And his is completely different. And not only that, he outright rejects any tie to metaphysics.
Right, yeah.
So, I mean, is there any position that seemed as more authoritative than any other? Or
so to be straightforward with you, Nietzsche just never says what he means.
Yeah.
And indeed, not just for accidental reasons, like indeed for quite... interesting, perhaps, reasons why you would get all these different interpretations of the will to power because of this actual problem, right? I mean, I would say especially be suspicious of someone like Russell.
Oh no, I am with Russell, because Russell hates Nietzsche and he makes it clear.
But even amongst people who do indeed like Nietzsche quite a bit, you find all kinds of different readings of this, and that's probably going to be inevitable because of what the will to power is supposed to be doing, or the role that it's supposed to be playing. It's going to be this really nebulous kind of role. I agree that there's some interpretation here, but there's some parts of what Heidegger is saying that I don't think is really interpretation. There's a bit, the way in which Heidegger, and I just think he does this more clearly than anyone else, which is why I'm using him, the way that Heidegger is going to characterize what role the will of power is playing will almost explain why he could therefore admit of so many different interpretations, I think. The basic idea is that if we get rid of the super sensible and we're not just going to throw something else in its place, we're not just going to throw socialism or utilitarianism or whatever into the place of it, we're going to need a completely different framework for valuation. That's going to be the will to power. Is going to be our new framework. But then that new framework is going to be really weird and underdetermined, and you could go in all kinds of different ways with it.
Okay.
Is that helpful? Because that's a very, very fair question. I mean, Heidegger's normal way of reading people is to read all of them as being a worse version of himself. And as we'll talk about, that's very clearly what he's doing here.
No, he's far more generous than Russell is on it.
But yeah, he at least usually is picking out interesting things about other people that they don't do quite as well as he does, as opposed to someone like Russell that just sort of wants to brush away things that disagree with his interpretation of the world. So. Yeah. And indeed, don't hesitate. I'm always game for critiquing Heidegger's readings of things. I am like I said, I'm not a Heideggerian, even though I was trained by a lot of Heideggerians in
No,
graduate.
I didn't have a problem with Heidegger's interpretation. I was just like, it blows my mind that you have like
Yeah,
something considered a major philosophical concept that nobody quite understands.
yeah.
Or there's so many different views on it.
Well, Nietzsche never defines himself. Nietzsche's just not a systematic thinker, right? He even when he actually does define the will to power in a couple places, right? But they don't all agree. Like he uses all these different definitions, and they seem to be really different. So, because he's just not systematic in a sense, he's more setting out a framework for thinking, and within that framework, you're going to get people going in all kinds of different ways. I mean, really, people say Kierkegaard is the first existentialist, and we might read a little bit of Kierkegaard if we have time later on. But I think really way more than Kierkegaard is Nietzsche's. Nietzsche is laying the foundation for existentialism, and existentialism just goes in a million different directions because there's no ground for anything. There is no actual super sensible ground on the basis of which you're going to justify yourself. So the kinds of justifications you can give are going to be really different and not agreeable to everyone. The 1 + 1 = 2, that has a rational foundation for that. The super sensible rational foundation of that truth just means people are going to agree on what it means more than whatever kind of foundation Nietzsche's leaving us with if we sort of get rid of that. So I hope that's helpful. It was a very good question. I hope that's
that is helpful.
Excellent. Good. I saw another hand, but now it's down, so I don't know who it was. Not going to get re-risen. Okay, well, whoever it was, I'm sorry if I missed you. Raise it again if the question comes back. All right, let's now turn to nihilism. So I was saying that as Heidegger's reading it, there's sort of basically two parts of Nietzsche's thought here. One is this idea of the death of God, and closely related to it is this idea of nihilism. So let's turn to nihilism, and then this will give us the will to power. We'll go relatively quickly through it. Like I said, I'm not going to go through the weeds of everything that Heidegger is saying here. It's just not worth our time. But I at least want to lay out the rough structure that he's laying out so that we can sort of see what this Nietzschean alternative is, and then maybe talk a little bit during just discussion stuff about how it relates to things like existentialism and what happens later in Western philosophy. Also, anyone, before I erase it, anyone want me to go back to that whiteboard for a second to write anything else down? Everyone got what you needed from it? All right, perfect. All right, so let's start talking some nihilism. All right. So nihilism, just in general, what does this word just mean? We can sort of just start there. Nihilism just means that all ideals and values are empty. And what do we mean by empty? Well, okay, I can use a couple more synonyms, right? We mean like groundless. That's another synonym we could use. But what do we basically mean? There actually is no actual transcendent justification of them. And so since they lack justification, ultimately, they seem to us as empty or as lacking in substance. And so what does this leave the world seeming like? This leaves, sort of the way that Taylor was sort of suggesting, it leaves the world just feeling sort of like cold, it leaves the world feeling empty, sort of hollow, shallow, everything superficial, nothing real, nothing has substance to it as a result. Nietzsche is usually called a nihilistic thinker, and sometimes he calls himself a nihilistic thinker too, so he's not wrong to be characterized in that way. But he also frequently says really negative things about nihilism too. And it's because there's sort of two different ways of understanding this devaluing of all ideals. So let's talk for a second about what Heidegger calls the inner logic of Western metaphysical history. Nietzsche never directly says any of this, but it fits so well with what he does say, it seems plausible to me to attribute it to him as well. But this is at least, so as Heidegger puts it, what is this inner logic? Because nihilism's not just supposed to be something that happened. Let me actually add that clarification. That could be useful. The sort of the possibility of nihilism, and indeed even in a certain sense the reality of nihilism, is something that both Nietzsche and Heidegger say this very explicitly. It's something that's been there in Western metaphysics from the start. It's something, if you go back to Plato, it's already there in Plato, or hints of it are already in Plato, I think. Or at least the way Plato gets taken up by everyone after Plato. So this isn't some new thing that happens. Nihilism is something that's sort of been along the road with us throughout the entire history of the West. Okay, so why? Here's the logic as Heidegger lays it out. And it's actually pretty simplistic in a certain sense. I mean, my hope is that all of you will be able to sort of recognize this in yourself, because this is sort of something that just all of us kind of just do. I posit some ideal or value. The world fails to live up to my ideal or value. I despair. This is the logic of the West, according to Heidegger. I posit something as good or important or valuable, the world doesn't live up to it, and then I get sad. Right? And as a result of my sorrow, I am tempted to give up. Let's translate this all now into this sort of metaphysical language a little bit. The supersensible world is supposed to supply me with the justification of my values. So let's just use as an example justice. This is the one I'll use justice and truth and go back and forth between the two today. Let's just use justice as an example. I look around me and what do I see? I see people behaving unjustly. And I don't like this. This makes me upset for whatever reason, doesn't matter why. For whatever reason, I say, you know what's really important? Justice. Justice is what's really important. But what is justice? Justice is the thing that's guaranteed in the supersensible world. Let's do the most simplified version of this. God says justice is good, and that justice will ultimately prevail. Right. So now my ideal or value, it's not just something I happen to like. It's something real. It's something important. It's something in the world. It's something indisputable. It's something I can, when all those unjust warrior type people come up to me and knock me over and steal things from my cart and say, where is your justice now? I can say, no, my justice is real. You all are ignorant of the truth. You don't really know the supersensible world. You don't know the word of God, right? It's not just some random thing I happen to like. It's something with substance to it. This ideal of justice. Okay. But of course, what's inevitably going to happen, the world is inevitably going to fall short of my ideal. Since my ideal is something in the supersensible, it won't actually be fully manifested in the world. Now, this is not something that should have been surprising to me in the first place, right? That was the whole point. The whole point of going to a supersensible world is that I looked around and didn't find the justice I was looking for in the sensible world anyway. That's why I went to the supersensible world, right? I mean, the whole point of this is that the sensible world is supposed to be imperfect and the supersensible was supposed to be the perfect one. This shouldn't have surprised me. That's why I appeal to the supersensible world in the first sense. But nevertheless, once I say justice is real, God says justice is good, God says that justice will ultimately prevail, and then, tomorrow, some dude runs up, knocks me over again, and steals all the goods out of my account, I conclude from this, there must not be a God. The curse, it must have been bullshit. The whole thing must have just been a bunch of nonsense. And you hear this all the time, right? Why is it that people leave Christianity, by and large? What's the reason? It's because something bad happens to them and they can't understand how a loving God, for example, would have allowed their father to have died. Or a loving God would have allowed their son to have gotten cancer. But of course, like, that was the whole point again, right? Like, there's something kind of like silly about all of this. The whole point is that the sensible world sucks, right? That's why we make reference to the super sensible world at all. It's supposed to sort of help deal with the fact of the various kinds of suckiness of the sensible world. And if the Christian whose Christianity is predicated upon the world basically working out for them, really is just radically misunderstanding the world. I mean, the world for Christians is frequently one of frequent suffering. This is not God somehow like violating any sort of promise, but nevertheless, it's sort of experienced and undergone as a kind of violation. If the super sensible world really had the kind of power that it says it does, wouldn't the sensible world be better? Earlier in the semester, when we were sort of going through this, we introduced this as the problem of theodicy in a certain sense, right? The problem of evil. Why does evil exist in a good world? It's broader than just that because it could be any sort of value you'd like. It doesn't just have to be sort of moral or ethical values. It could be whatever value I care for, value of truth, value of beauty, but there's not so much ugliness everywhere, truth, but there's so many lies everywhere, whatever value you want, right? But ultimately, the sort of nihilistic root at the heart of Western history, according to both Nietzsche and Heidegger, I think this is fair to attribute to Nietzsche too, is that the sensible world just doesn't live up to the super sensible world, even though it wasn't supposed to, but it seems like it should, and so what good is actually the super sensible world? Almost like put it almost that way, like what good is the super sensible if it doesn't actually fix the sensible world? What value is it to me if it doesn't solve my problem? So this is the sort of the nihilistic logic at the heart of all things. How are we doing so far? I just want to stop here for a second. How are you with this logic? Do you get why I'm calling it, and really Heidegger's calling it nihilistic logic? And do you see how and why he thinks this is sort of just inevitable if you posit a distinction between the sensible world and the super sensible world? Because that's the claim. The claim is that once you make that decision, you're always going to be disappointed in both of them. You're going to be disappointed in the super sensible because it doesn't make the sensible better, and you'll be disappointed in the sensible because it doesn't live up to the super sensible. So that disappointment is just an inevitable consequence of making this distinction, according to Nietzsche and Heidegger. Is that making sense? All right, so if we're good so far, there's basically two reactions you can have to this problem. There's complete nihilism and incomplete nihilism. Let's start with incomplete nihilism first. The incomplete nihilists are basically all the people that Nietzsche despises. Nietzsche actually has more respect for like actually devout Christians than he does for most of the people calling themselves atheists, because he thinks at least the people who are actually devout Christians are being consistent. All the people running around calling themselves atheists but still presupposing the transcendent are just incoherent and stupid. At least they're just engaged in nonsense. This is this possibility of incomplete nihilism. So let's track out what it was. We sort of talked about this a little bit last time. So here's one possibility. I could decide that I'm going to reject the supersensible world. But I could preserve the structure of justification that was sort of presupposed by the supersensible world. So I say there's no God, I reject God, but I just put reason in God's place. And of course, what's the problem? The problem is reason's not going to do according to Nietzsche at least, what's the problem with all this? Reason's just not going to do the job as well as God did. God does the job of supplying this foundation of justification for values really well, actually. Right? Because God said so is a pretty strong trump card to make. If I'm going to be Kant and I'm going to put reason in God's place, well, I'm going to have to use reason to then prove all the stuff that I could just say, believe that because God said you should believe it. And it's going to be hard and not work, and not, at the very least, whether it works or not almost, it's not going to be compelling to most people. Most people don't read Kant and decide to become better people. Whereas, like, God saying, I'll send you to hell if you don't do this, that actually might make people act better, obey the values that they're supposed to act. But I could put other things other than reason. I could put the state. There is no God. So I could become a fascist, and that's fine. Fascism, I could just put the state in the place where God belonged. I could be British, and I could put pleasure in the place, or utility. Whatever else you'd like. I could put art in the place. Or I could put, so this is sort of what the Romantics did. The Romantics basically put art into the place of God, or beauty into the place of God, or what have you, whatever else you want. Throw science in there, whatever you'd want. I could put that in God's place and pretend as if all of the old values now just, that they can remain the same values, they just now have a different value. They just have a different justification for them. Because all of these things that we're pointing to, or the reason, the state, pleasure, utilities, science, right? The reason why anyone ever thought any of those things were good, it goes back, those are all basically Christian things to say are good or important. Right? So it's sort of preserving different aspects of the old Christian values and just pretending we can just give those things a different justification. Why is this nihilism ultimately? Because I'm not actually really able to justify anything in this way. The justifications, they don't really work. I can try, Nietzsche thinks, to prove morality using rationality, but I'm not going to do it. I can lie to myself and think that I've done it. Or I'm not going to be able to justify why anyone at all should care about art or looking at mountains just by looking at the mountains, but I can pretend that will happen. It's not really going to work. So ultimately, all the values still are groundless. This is still nihilism. And maybe if I'm really being honest, I even recognize that and acknowledge it. But I'm still preserving the same structure. I leave the structure behind. And that's why it's incomplete. It's incomplete because I still leave the same structure behind. I don't move past it. And so when Nietzsche is making fun of atheists, this is always why Nietzsche makes fun of atheists. He thinks all of these atheists are just pretending that the world will go on just the same as it ever did. We just don't have God anymore. But as he puts it in various places, right, like Christianity is a really internally consistent, self-complete system with God as the foundation of it. Get rid of God, the system collapses, the system falls apart. So a couple things to note here. Nietzsche is indeed presupposing, first of all, that it's not actually possible for any of these other justifications to actually work. That doesn't strike me as especially controversial. I mean, you might have like Kantians who think Kant works, but even the Kantians who think Kant's argument works fully acknowledge the fact that at the very least it doesn't like move most people. Remember, that's a sense in which God being live mattered, right? God's life and death. It has nothing to do with whether or not God actually exists. Nietzsche doesn't think God exists, but that's almost beside the point. The point is that the idea of God doesn't move people anymore. And the idea of reason, that one doesn't really move people very much either. Or the idea of the state outside of like really rare self-destructive scenarios like Nazi Germany, right? Like that idea burns itself out really fast. Or the French Revolution. That idea burns itself out really fast. Right? None of those foundations are going to actually do the work needed to really actually concretely justify and ground the values that people claim to hold. How are we doing with the incomplete nihilism? Any questions here? Is the sense in which it's both nihilistic but not all the way, is that clear to people? All right, good. Any other questions or thoughts so far? Go ahead, Rachel, you should be unmuted.
It's just not like totally clear to me. If we could just elaborate on that point for a second, like how it's incomplete, like that's still.
Yeah. So the sense in which it's incomplete, good. So let me go back to the whiteboard. The sense in which it's incomplete, what does it get rid of in the old logic? So let's go back to what does it get rid of? It still it gets rid of the super sensible world. But it tries to sort of have the sensible world or various other things serve in the same place or role that the supersensible world still occupied. So the job of the supersensible world was to justify things external to the world. So I say there's no God, so I get rid of that justification, but I put in reason as a new justification. But reason is something at least sort of pseudo-supersensible. Like, I can't exactly point to and pick up reason. It's kind of an abstraction. The same thing about the state. I can't pick up the state. I can't point to the state. It's this abstraction. Pleasure and utility, same thing. Art, same thing. Like I'm still pointing to things that are sort of just beyond the world, or at least like only ambiguously present in the world to justify my values. So I'm still trying to justify my values. Let's maybe put it that way, see if that helps. I'm still engaged in the process of trying to justify my values. By reference to something beyond the mere apparent facts of life. Be it the thing that I point to, be it reason, be it beauty, be it the state, be it pleasure, whatever. I'm still trying. I'm in this activity of trying to justify my values and thinking that my values need to be justified in some sense. So does that help with the incompleteness? Does that make the incompleteness clearer, Rachel?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
Thank you.
Good. Any others? Any other sort of further questions on this sort of incomplete form? Go ahead, William. You should be unmuted.
Yeah. So just as an aside to things like, the incomplete nihilist claiming that things like justice and God don't exist in the supersensible world, but like they have clear effects on the world, our world, right? We still strive for, justice, freedom, a godly life, and all that stuff. I mean, can that as sort of us fooling ourselves?
Well, no, a couple things to know here. First of all, some people do. Not everyone, but some people do. But that's fine. That's not necessarily a huge difference. So, how would they? So Nietzsche's response to that is that Yeah, those things like impact the world, but they impact the world only insofar as people find them valuable. So their impact on the world isn't proof that they're valuable, it presupposes people finding them valuable, right?
Hmm.
Why do, to the extent that people do, why do people refrain from doing actions because they think those actions are unjust? Because they care about justice. They think justice is important and that it matters. Right. So sure, justice has an impact on the world, but it only has an impact on the world insofar as people find it valuable.
Right.
The same thing is true about God. That's the idea behind God is dead, right? Like, even though Nietzsche is a hardened atheist, doesn't think God ever existed, right? So long as the idea of God did work, God lived, quote unquote, right? He did things in the world, but that's just to say people did things because they thought God mattered, right? Like, the priest who's in the Inquisition putting me on the rack for blasphemy, even if there is no God and there is no blasphemy, the idea of God and the idea of blasphemy is doing a lot of work in the world right now, right? It's shaping so much. It has life to it. It has power to it. The death of God is the death of that power.
Okay, yeah.
And that power was the power of God. It was the justification of why I should care about justice, and so put you on the rack for committing a crime.
Mm-hmm.
Or whatever, right? Or why I should care about truth, and so should reject the Ptolemaic model of the universe for the Copernican one. Does that help? Does that?
Yeah, definitely.
It's not so, why any of these things matter, they only matter in the world insofar as it matters to us that they matter in the world. Otherwise, they don't matter in the world at all. That's the sense in which all of them are still super sensible. They all make reference in a certain weird sense back to us. And where we're going to go here, Nietzsche himself isn't a subjectivist, but we're going to see how subjectivism sort of comes out of this. I might just say all values are just me. Right, and that's basically kind of is what Nietzsche's saying. It's a super weird way of saying it, but maybe I am valuation. I'm the source of all values because values only ever mattered insofar as I actually valued them.
Right.
Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome, good. Any other last comments, or should we turn to the complete nihilism? The world today? Yeah, let's turn to complete nihilism. Every time I turn on the news, I feel like I'm watching complete nihilism. So sure, let's get complete with our nihilism. All right. So possibility 2. Let's start talking complete nihilism. And so whenever Nietzsche calls himself a nihilist, he's talking in this second sense. Complete nihilism, what would it have to do? So almost put it in that sense, right? What would it have to do if it's not going to be this sort of incomplete version? It will have to actually reject the entire structure of seeking justification for values. Which means then, since it's still going to have to posit values, Nietzsche thinks, it means that we're going to have to develop some completely different account of what values are, where they emerge, and what, if anything, justifies them. I'm going to have to be really careful because whatever sort of justification, sort of quote unquote, we're going to find in this new system, it's not going to it can't even resemble the kind of super sensible justifications that we've been giving so far. We need a new account evaluation, one that starts from scratch, one that completely leaves behind the super sensible world, completely leaves behind metaphysics. Right? And so Nietzsche's claim is that he moves beyond metaphysics. Heidegger doesn't actually think he does, but that's at least Nietzsche's claim. Right. So we're not going to, this is where we're not going to go through all the details, just because one, Nietzsche's not super specific, first of all. Two, Heidegger, because Nietzsche's not being specific, is having to throw in a bunch of his own stuff into this, and our goal is not to really do a lot of work on Heidegger. That would be a whole separate project. And lastly, almost because we don't really need to get super clear on the, our goal was to figure out what transcendence meant more tthan anything else. And I think, at least I'm hoping we've done a pretty good job of making clear what this idea of transcendence is at least pointing toward. So we'll really fast do a quick little overview of what Nietzsche's alternative is. Heidegger, I can just say straight away, Heidegger doesn't think Nietzsche's alternative works. He thinks Nietzsche's alternative still is entirely within the scope of the history of Western metaphysics, and is still entirely within the scope of the super-sensible, sensible distinction. For what that's worth, most people don't think Nietzsche's alternative really works. It's not clear to me that Nietzsche himself thinks that Nietzsche's alternative actually works, or that he fully knows what the alternative is. He never actually claims to have an alternative. He claims that he's sort of laying the foundation for some alternative to come in the future. But we can at least lay out the rough outline of what is this alternative, right? And it's what Nietzsche calls the will to power. What does this mean? It means what is a value according to the will to power? A value is a point of view that directs the striving of life. All right, I'm sure that clarifies everything for you all. So let's try to break. First, let me just do this really schematically first, and then we'll try to give some actual concrete examples of this. Okay, so what do we mean by the striving of life, first of all? Life always has two basic features, according to Nietzsche. It preserves itself, and it enhances itself. Right? Think keeping yourself alive and growing would be an example. Or preserving your bodily integrity and then going forth and eating something and making yourself bigger or larger in that sense, right? These two go together. You're not doing one if you're not doing both of them. Preserving your life requires expanding your domain. If you're ever remaining stagnant, you're already sick and dying. And so to come up with one phrase that characterizes all of this, Nietzsche talks about this as the will to power. So if we had to sort of characterize this will to power, Nietzsche characterizes it, first of all, as a desire for domination. What do we mean by domination, though? We mean something pretty weird, right? Or also will to mastery. That's the other language he uses. Think master morality here. That's part of what's going on in the backdrop. This is the will to be in control both of yourself, and this is indeed quite important. It's not enough to just control other people. To be in control of yourself, and then by extension, others. You've mastered a situation. And so he thinks everyone has this, like even the lowest of slaves still wants to be master. Not master even necessarily of other people, just wants to have mastered themselves, mastered their world, mastered their situation, right? And so this takes the form of a kind of commanding, he thinks. Right? Which first of all just means self-command, right? If you aren't actually in command of yourself, it's not possible to be in command of anything else. So given that this structure has to forever be pushing outward, pushing outside of itself, concretely, what does this mean? What is the will to power? Here's two ways we can characterize it, and they're both basically equivalent. It's will, willing, willing, or power expanding its power. And so it's always progressive. It's never standing still. It's never remaining stationary. How is all of this valuing? Again, we're almost done with the schematic. I will try to make this make more sense when we actually start doing some concrete examples of it, because all the schematic stuff just sounds like nonsense. Right? How does all this relate to valuing? Values are the conditions set forth by the will for its own expansion and preservation. Okay. So, yeah, there's as you can see, there's a very good reason why so many people can give so many different interpretations of all of this, because it's not clear at all what any of this means. And it's not clear in Nietzsche either. Like, it's not clear exactly what this means. Let's look at some examples and see if that will help add a little bit of clarity to this rather confusing schematic puzzle. Okay, so let us say that I am sick. All right. So what's going on if I'm sick? Okay, so I'm probably in some degree of pain. Being sick's not fun. I probably can't engage in the activities that I normally want to engage within, right? And I get frustrated as a result of this, right? Getting sick is incredibly frustrated. One, because it's painful, right? But two, just more like I can't go forth and do the things that I would normally go forth and do on the basis of it, right? I feel stagnant, I feel constrained, right? And I feel bad. Okay, so what am I going to do in this situation, right? Life won't allow me, Nietzsche thinks, to just sort of sit it there and take it. I'm going to have to do something with this experience. So what can I do? What are my options? One thing, I could become resigned. I could become the ascetic priest. I could say, okay, I need to get control over the situation. I'm trapped in this stupid body that won't stop getting sick, that's now stuck on the couch, that's continually throwing up, right? It's doing all kinds of gross things too, like it's doing all kinds of like ugly things, shameful things. So I'm gonna say, guess what? I'm not really this body at all. Screw this body. Screw you, body. I'm tired of you. I'm tired of you getting in my way, not letting me do things, thwarting my projects. I'm gonna take control of my life. I'm not gonna let you be the boss of me anymore. Guess what's really important? The transcendent world. I become an ascetic priest. By becoming the ascetic priest, by saying this body, this life, that's not the real body, that's not the true body, that's not the true life, I have taken control of the situation. I have mastered a situation that before I was hopeless in the face of. Right? I was just at the whims of my body. Now it's not. Now I'm like, yeah, I'm sick. So what? Screw this body. This sickness will be a perfect opportunity for me to become closer to God. Like it happens when Saint Teresa is dying of tuberculosis. And she kind of rejoices in it a little bit. She's like, yeah, it sucks to be dying of tuberculosis, right? But Christ, he suffered on the cross. And so now through my suffering, I can get closer to Christ. I have taken control. I have taken command of a situation that was previously entirely outside of my control. How did I do so? By positing the value of the ascetic ideal. The ascetic ideal was the tool of value by which I extended my control over the situation. Now, does that mean I'm going to get better? No, it doesn't. Right? That wasn't even necessarily one of my options, though. What I've done is I've taken control of my situation. I've exerted the will to power. And so Nietzsche, as a result, Nietzsche says, like, yeah, the priests, no one seeks power like a priest, right? They try to control all of their circumstances by rejecting their circumstances, by saying to their circumstances, you can't touch me. That's stoicism we were talking about, right? That sort of intellectual stoicism. That's another form of this, another form of positing forth a value that through that value, I now control the world. Right? Even if and you say, well, no, you only seem to control the world. No. We're getting rid of that distinction. I command my circumstance. The world no longer commands me, I command it. That would be an example of the will to power, and the will to power as being a source of valuation. Here would be another one, by the way. This is a much more simple and basic one. Oh, I'm sick. This sucks. Curse you, God. I abandon God. I reject you, right? Because you've let me be in this horrible situation. That also is the will of power. Because again, what have I done? I have taken control of the situation. I've taken it back from God. God, previously I had been the one who was making me sick. I've rejected it. I've taken all of it back. Now, God no longer has power over me. I've taken control of my situation. How? By changing my valuation, by positing a value, articulating a value. Right? And now I get the corresponding benefit, right, of feeling better, right? At least I got to tell God off. I still might be sick, but at least I get that little bit of pleasure, right? Or I might still be sick, but at least I can now do something, quote unquote, productive in my situation. I can get closer to Christ through that. Okay? Life can't, Nietzsche thinks, just give up. Nietzsche just doesn't think it's actually a possibility. Giving up is itself a way of trying to take control of your situation. I give up. I can't. I throw my hands up. I can't do anything. That itself is precisely you taking control of the situation, saying I can't control the situation, so therefore I won't try anymore. And then putting it under your will, right? Now you're making the situation how you want it to be. Is there any justification for any of these three possibilities? Nope. There is no justification besides the will that's willed it. Right? If you want to put it this way, I am the justification for it. I justify these values by valuing them, by willing them, by choosing them as an extension of my own power. And we maybe can say that some of them are quite unhealthy, right? Nietzsche wants to say the ascetic ideal is a rather unhealthy ideal. But nevertheless, it is indeed will to power, and so is in that sense entirely justified as a will to power, right? As power itself. Did that help at all? Did it help with this will to power at all? Let's ask some questions. I'm done with the text pretty much for the day, so all I want to do the rest of the day is just try to get some loose sense of what this idea of the will to power actually could mean. How about another example? Maybe let's try a completely different example and see if this one helps. Okay. So Nietzsche thinks that the scientist is exerting a strong will to power. Why? Because what is it that science does? Science lets me categorize the world, and categorizing itself is already power, right? If I can say what things are, I have power over them. Okay. So it lets me categorize the world, but it also lets me predict it. I can predict what's going to happen in the future using my science, right? So I can control it in that sense. And because science is truth, and I can assert truth as this principle of valuation, I also can assert the dominance of science over all other pursuits. So if someone's like, hey, we should build a road, I can be like, building roads? Okay, loser. No, give your money to the science. Science is where it's really at. Science is the really important activity. And the road builder can then come back and fight me, but, right, I now can make a claim for what I think is important as being what's really important through the activity of science. I can assert it as value, and so therefore I can actually compete with other systems of valuation to get what I want out of the situation. Religion, the exact same thing Nietzsche thinks. As far as Nietzsche is concerned, religion is just another will to power, right? When the priest can get you to go along, what has the priest done? The priest has made you subordinate yourself to the priest. Right? When Nietzsche's talking about all this conflict and stuff, he's not really talking about physical fighting. He's actually really uninterested in physical fighting. What he's interested in is in fights of valuation. Right? When the Jewish priests got the Roman warriors to become Jewish priests, that is a far greater victory than you can get from just stabbing a dude. Right? You've extended your will upon them, not just your sword. It's easy to extend your sword in someone and kill them. You've extended your will. You've extended your system of values upon their system of values. You've proven your power. You've expanded yourself. Okay. I mean, be thinking here a little bit like the image here, why he's calling all of this life, is just this idea of almost just like what happens if you ever seen like a vine. What do vines do to trees? They literally strangle them. Why? because vines hate trees? No, just because vines got to grow. And it's just by growing, the vine has to kill everything else around it. That's this idea of the will to power. For you to gain control, you need to gain power over everything else around you. And how can you do that preeminently? By defining the values that everything else around you will have to become subordinate to or will have to obey. Is any of this helping? This isn't our primary target anyway, so it's okay if this remains a little bit obscure, but I'd like to at least make it make a little bit more sense than it currently does. Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like, so if Nietzsche thinks that life continually tries to enhance, preserve and enhance itself, that this somehow gives a greater value to something like science, as if I'm sick, science might actually cure me, as opposed to me just either throwing up my hands, accepting death, or being miserable for a long time until I die. So when you had asked a previous class, why should we care? I think we should care in terms of science, because science is a means of preserving and enhancing life.
But notice what you've done. I won't even say you're wrong. Everything you just said is fine from Nietzsche's perspective, but notice what you've done, right? You've taken the situation. So what's the situation? People get sick. And you've tried to take control of it by dominating it through science. And so saying science is valuable because it lets me dominate this sickness. Okay, that's fine. But St. Teresa's solution did that just as well as yours.
Well, no, actually, she died and I didn't.
Yeah, so, but you're gonna die sooner or later anyway.
I'll die
right?
eventually, sure.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying is the science offers a path that seems to me to be a better life preserver and enhancer, as opposed to praying to God to cure my illness.
Sure, maybe. Let's say sure. Let's just say yes. Let's just go with it, right? But even still, like, so again, know what it is that you're actually saying. You added something in. You smuggled something in, right? What you smuggled in is that to preserve and enhance life means to live as long as possible, and that's not obvious. Because, right, because again, here's one way I can, because that only is the preserving side. Remember, let me go back to the whiteboard for a second, right? If you're stagnant, you're already dying, right? Stagnancy, if you're just maintaining, that's not what we're looking for, right? Just maintaining your life isn't going anywhere. So if, for the sake of argument, I'm not even trying to disagree with you, but if for the sake of the argument, the only way that science could preserve your life was to cause you to indefinitely stagnate, then your approach does not. Your approach is a rather unhealthy will to power, right? Because it has to be, and it is what Nietzsche thinks. Nietzsche literally just looks at scientists and he's kind of like, wow, they're pathetic people. They sort of like sit in their labs and like look under their little microscopes, and you know what no one's going to write an epic poem about? That. And for him, it almost is almost like that basic or that obvious, right? Like they're just, it's like a sickly little life, the life of like laboratories and careful measurements. Yeah, you can maybe do the preserving half by being careful and measuring things and all that, right? But that actually wasn't what Nietzsche would have thought was interesting in what you said. What Nietzsche thought was interesting in what you initially said wasn't the preserving life part. It was the dominating the sickness. That was what was cool. That was what was interesting about it. Taking mastery over this illness, grinding it to dust, whereas those prayers to God don't do anything. But with this penicillin, I will take the sickness and I will exert my will upon it and make it die or work for me or whatever. Like maybe I'm using CRISPR technology and I'm going to genetically engineer the bacteria and make it literally work for me, even better, right? That's the cool part of science. That's the will to dominance part of science. Right. The actual preserving life stuff, that's just sickness. That's just potentially stagnancy, at least. Does that help? Does that at least?
Well, yeah. I mean, I understand. I guess I was trying to make a point, as I said, referring back to you had asked at one time why we should
Yeah.
care about
Right.
science.
Right.
And we should care because it actually, I think, fits in kind of nicely with Nietzsche's will to power.
He's
More
fine
so-
with it. He's fine with it as an expression of the will to power, but that doesn't make it in and of itself better than any other expression of will to power. So it indeed, Saint Therese is also doing is engaging in the will to power when she reinterprets her sickness as a chance to get closer to God. That, just as will to power, at least, those are both equally, quote unquote, will to power. Those are both will to powers, right? And the ascetic priest doing the same thing, right? And the person who's cursing God is doing it. Like all of these are actively trying to take control of the situation, and so therefore it's they're all instances of the will to power. But yes, in that regard, at least science does fit, and is indeed a value we can have. I mean, Nietzsche himself values and follows sort of scientific, not like natural science as much, but he does follow along with natural science and actually uses it at various points as part of his justification for the death of God and stuff. But he just also asserts that it's like completely arbitrary that he's choosing to will in that way rather than willing in some other way. Then maybe does that last point help?
Yeah.
It is perhaps a justification, but it's still an arbitrary one.
Right. Okay.
There's no per se reason, at least, maybe there is in fact going to be some reason, ultimately. There's no per se reason to prefer one kind of will to power to another one. They're both systems of value. All right, good. Tim, go ahead.
So, to the point David just made, isn't he already like doing the Nietzschean thing by looking at science as an instrumental thing rather than an end in itself? And is that not more what Nietzsche has a problem with, looking at science as an end in itself?
Potentially, but there's also potentially problems. He might object to others using it instrumentally. So if I'm one of these British utilitarians and I say science is valuable because it's a tool to let me enhance the utility of the greatest number of people or whatever, he's still going to dislike that too, because it's still presupposing as the end that I'm instrumentally using it for some absolute value, like utility is some absolute value or something like that. So it's not just the fact that it's instrumental, that's not enough, that maybe is necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for it to actually be what he's talking about here. It also needs to be the case that even the thing that I'm instrumentally using it toward, that's also arbitrary and just an expression of the will to power too. Does that make sense, or does that help?
That does. Now, the second thing I wanted to bring up is Russell did make what I felt was one really fair objection.
He's a very smart philosopher, so I don't want to take anything against
Russell.
So
Russell's problem with it is that he says, Nietzsche tears down the foundations but doesn't build something up in their place. And the reason he says that is he doesn't think the will to power scheme is legitimate, because he says you can never have an objective value system over it. Everything would be, Russell sees it as degenerating into hypersubjectivity.
that's a really good question. Okay, we have to define a little bit what we mean by hypersubjectivity a little bit. Because it's going to devolve into one of two things. It's either going to become what Russell's calling hypersubjectivity, or it's going to become existentialism. Both of which Heidegger dislikes too, actually. but those aren't exactly the same thing, hypersubjective. So what are we left with here? So it's not going to be any objective foundation for value. That's 100% right. What you just said there, that's 100% right. And indeed, any effort to go back to an objective system of value is going to just fall back up into incomplete nihilism, right? What we need to do is stop looking for some transcendent actual justification for our values. Okay, so that's right. We're going to need to not do that. Okay, now to say that makes everything subjective is true in one very limited sense. Everything is perspectival, right? Every will to power is my will to power or someone's will to power, right? There's no will to power that's not the expression of some life living. Now, that's not necessarily subjectivism in the normal sense that we use the term, though, because the normal sense of the term is used basically as a moral reproach, right? So like subjective morality, right, is the morality that I come up with. as opposed to the morality you come up with. But Nietzsche's not interested in morality at all. So there is no moral system that we're supposed to be left with on the basis of this, right? What he's interested in is competition and power, right? So we're not going to get, what we're going to get with all these different perspectives is they're going to fight each other, in effect. I mean, again, not necessarily with fists, or maybe with fists, but they're going to fight each other, and the dominant one that wins will be the new value of the age, right? That's not exactly subjectivism, because like for it to win, it's gonna have to subvert me, get me to go along with it, right? So your will to power is gonna have to overcome mine to some extent, and I'll have to submit to you. So it will be interpersonal, at least to some extent, even though the root of it is it's rooted in my will to power. That's the foundation for it. And I think Nietzsche just doesn't think, and at least the broader existentialist tradition in general, just doesn't think any of this is a problem. Like, yeah, it would be maybe better if God did exist, but God doesn't exist. So therefore, there is no objective valuation. That's just the fact of the matter, Russell. So we can keep pretending God does exist when he doesn't, but that's just going to be all these incomplete forms of nihilism, and all of those are going to stifle the will to power. Those are all sickly in some sense. So what we have to do is just accept the fact that, yeah, there is no objective found. Sartre says this directly in one of his public speeches. He's just like, yeah, it sucks that God doesn't exist, but it's just the fact of the matter, right? Like, don't blame us for the fact that we say all morality, that there's no objective foundation for anything, and then also say God doesn't exist, because those mean the same thing. Right? And Russell is indeed an atheist. So, I mean, Nietzsche would just say, like, you yourself are just as subjected to this concern that you can't supply a real transcendent foundation for any value you posit either. So, yeah, I mean, so what existentialism will say, what's the practical upside of all of this? The practical upside of all of this is that now human beings get to create value for themselves. And that's going to look really different than we thought it looked before, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. And yeah, it's a system, at least. Like, it's at least like internally coherent, I guess. The Sartrean kind of value creation system. And it fits, I mean, Nietzsche's will to power sort of fades out, but this idea of value creation gets preserved throughout the 20th century continental philosophy. So I said a lot, and your question was very good, and I don't know if I fully even like dealt with your question exactly, so maybe follow it up or.
No, it was a good answer. It's just, I mean, because I haven't read anybody who has a good answer to that, and it almost seems like how whatever answer you give is going to depend on your framework, because Russell's coming from the logical positivist tradition. Yeah. Unless you can demonstrate something as a fact via logic and mathematics, it's to be tossed out. So it's just weird. But I like your answer because it did show that there are so many different traditions that are informed by Nietzsche. So many. Oh
yeah, he's foundational. That's why he's worth our time. Because of how, I mean, I think even Taylor, who's coming from explicitly this Catholic perspective, Taylor is still fundamentally doing a Nietzschean project, for all the differences within it. And yeah, one thing maybe to just say about a little bit more about like the Russell and the logical positivists. With logical positivists, basically that's another variant of what we've been calling the scientific materialism, right? Like Nietzsche's gonna say, like, look, like you can't actually justify your principles, right? Like this principle of rational demonstration or facts, right? And indeed, logical positivism collapses in the 30s because it literally can't do that. This actually is when Gettier gives the incompleteness proof, he actually demonstrates that second order logic can't justify second order logic, at which point like the whole system of logical positivism collapses. The values devalue themselves. Right? It can't actually justify what it says is valuable. And that was the death of logical positivism. I mean, people still keep doing it, right? But that's just, again, the God is dead situation. Like, God is dead and people still believe in him, but there's no reason for it anymore. The values have devalued themselves. Good. Any other thoughts on this? We're at the end of class. All right. We don't need to be too worried about this Nietzsche stuff, right? Nietzsche himself is not our primary target here. Our target is this idea of transcendence. And it's enough for today to actually just, if all we can see is that if we are going to really try to get rid of this system of justification that sort of presupposes transcendence in some sense, how difficult our task is going to be to try to come up with an alternative to it. What I want us to do for Thursday, so there's not going to be a new reading. I actually want to basically just give you an account of where all this transcendence stuff comes from. What I actually specialize in is Plato. That's actually my specialty. So sort of the foundation of all of this stuff that Nietzsche and Heidegger are calling this Platonism, the metaphysical Platonism. I actually just want to go through very loosely what the argument for it is, where it comes from, why Plato says it, and then how it gets taken up by some of Plato's sort of followers. And then on Tuesday, we'll describe how early Christianity and early Jewish thought incorporates a lot of this Platonism as sort of the philosophical framework to explain what it's doing and to explain what's going on with it. So at the end of that period, I think we should have I'm hoping at least we'll have a pretty reasonable sense of what transcendence is, why you might want to posit it, and what happens if you don't want to posit it. And then we can use that as a way of sort of talking about religion in general, because if religion really does involve a kind of transcendence, reclaiming some sense of why you would want to talk about transcendence in the first place would probably be valuable to all of us. Many of you have already expressed to me in some variant of, I don't even understand why you would ever posit any of this transcendence stuff anyway. So I'm hoping we're making that clearer, and we're going to try to make it clearer for another week. Any last questions or thoughts or anything? All right. Thank you all very much. I know, the times are odd and difficult and challenging in all kinds of different ways. So let me know if there's anything I can do to help with anything going on class-wise or otherwise. And I will see you all on Thursday.